Today I would like to talk to you about public employee labor unions and uh, public sector budget deficits, so state and local budget deficits. And specifically, I'm going to talk to you about the reasons for cutting wages and benefits in the public sector, the arguments in favor of doing so for the sake of budget deficits, and the arguments made by scholars that hold the opposing view that the public sector does not drive budget deficits. Public sector workers, public sector labor unions specifically don't drive up uh, state and local budget deficits. So, there are a couple of different arguments around this issue. First, the argument for cutting wages and benefits in the public sector in order to manage budget deficits. So, the idea here is that unions drive up wages and the costs of benefits, and there's plenty of research that shows that unionized workforces on average make more than non-union workforces, and they have better healthcare benefits and retirements. And so, from the union's perspective and from unionized workers' perspective, this is a good thing. If you join a union, if you collectively bargain, you see the benefit of that through bargaining higher wages and better benefits. And as workers, we all like higher wages and better benefits. And so there's plenty of research that shows that unionized workforces do have better wages and benefits than their non-union counterparts in the same positions. Teachers in union-dominant states have better pay and benefits than teachers in non-union states. So, that's not particularly controversial, but it does have some impact that could be considered negative. So in the private sector, when unions negotiate for better wages and benefits, they're negotiating for a share of the profit. They're negotiating for the share of the company profit. So if the Ford workers negotiate better wages, they're going to be cutting into the profit margins of making Ford trucks and SUVs. And they can't get too aggressive, because if they get too aggressive, then they risk cutting so far into profit margins that the company doesn't make a profit, and then the company goes out of business. Government is a little bit different, because government doesn't go out of business. So when public employees are negotiating for wages and benefits, they're negotiating for a share of tax dollars. And so while it's great for the teachers if they make more money and they have better benefits, and that does have arguably positive impacts on the local schools and the local community in the long run, there is the argument to be made that it does make government less efficient. So it drives up wages and benefits that otherwise the taxpayers would be paying less for those services. So when it makes government less efficient, what we mean is you could be paying teachers less to do the same job, but because of the public sector unions, you're paying them more, and therefore you're spending more taxpayer dollars on a service that you could be getting for less. You could be more efficient with taxpayer money. And so scholars and politicians will sometimes argue that this is bad for the public sector. This is bad for government, because you're driving up the cost to the taxpayers, and the goal should be to give quality public services like trash pickup and police officers and firefighters and quality services for in exchange for a reasonable amount of tax dollars, and unions drive up and inflate the costs of these services. So the argument becomes that public employees should not be negotiating for taxpayer dollars. The part of that argument is also that you don't get to elect your boss in the private sector. But one of the arguments made against public employee unions and collective bargaining is that the teachers get to elect the school board, theoretically, that they negotiate against. So then the administrators are in a position where they when they come to the bargaining table, they don't have just the public's best interest in mind. They don't have just the budget's best interest in mind and the operations of the school, for example. They also end up having the teachers' interests in mind, because the teachers are the ones that are helping elect them. This is, of course, assuming that your teachers live in the same community that they teach in, which we know is not always the case. But that is one of the arguments made. So, public employees with strong collective bargaining rights are correlated with higher costs of government, which then makes government less efficient. So then the solution to budget deficit problems would be to drive down wages of your public sector by busting the unions. That is one argument to be made, and there's some data that supports that, and there's some data that doesn't. The argument against cutting the public sector as a way of solving budget deficits is that this is a false narrative, that the public employee wages are not actually what's driving deficits when states and local governments are in deficits. Most recently, states started to curtail, cut collective bargaining rights from public employees following the Great Recession. So states started to run deficits that may not have been actually connected to public employees because there was a Great Recession. There was a high unemployment. And so the people who say, no, it's not the public employee unions that are making government run so inefficiently and run up deficits, that's not actually the cause. The cause was economic downturn following the Great Recession and high unemployment and a very bad housing market. And so you have fewer people in the community working, you collect fewer taxes, therefore you run bigger deficits. Some of the evidence that shows that public employees might not be the problem, the size of the public sector hasn't grown, it's been pretty stable. And wages in the public sector, government salary and benefits, when adjusted for inflation, have remained pretty stable too. So a lot of the opponents of these of reforms that cut public employee bargaining with the argument of this is going to save the community money, and these unions have gotten too aggressive and they have these amazing benefits and everything. One of the arguments against that is, well, if you look at the data, public employees aren't making the cost of public employment didn't go up for the local community. The tax base went down following the Great Recession. One of the other things that's happened here is that states have done a good job of state legislatures and different groups have done a good job of making private sector unionization hard to achieve. So the days of strong private sector unions are long over, and so now the private sector is paying less than it used to because those unions aren't driving up wages in the private sector. So now these public employees have what looks like better jobs than they would in the private sector. So this makes working in the public sector look like there's more, there's better wages and there's better benefits. And in the past, yes, you would make less money working as a public school custodian than you would going to work on the Ford line, and you probably still do, though I can't speak to that specifically. Uh, your the trade-off was you had really great health care in the public sector, and public sector a lot of times comes with uh, good pensions. So those things are being chipped away too, to save local governments money, and the private sector doesn't have the strong unions driving up wages, which then make public sector work look more appealing and look even less efficient than it might be. So those are kind of, that's just an overview of the arguments made on both sides, and of this budget deficit debate as to what actually causes local budget deficits. That there's a little bit of evidence on each side of this argument, and that's what we're covering this week. Thank you.